All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for YYCJS. We've got a very special guest that we'll get to in a minute here. First, just some housekeeping and some intros. So my name's Ian. I'm one of the organizers. You may know me. I work at a company in town here called Neo. We are hiring. Got to get the plug in there. And our tech stack is pretty much entirely JavaScript. So if you're interested in writing JavaScript at one of Canada's biggest, fastest growing tech startups, get in touch. My Twitter handle is there on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me. That's pretty much all I have to say. I'll turn it over to Serene.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. I'm Serene. I'm one of the organizers. Really glad to have Ian here with me helping out this week. I think we're going to try to make this a more regular thing. I work at Pixeltree. For anybody who doesn't know me, we are also hiring, along with like every other company in the world. We hire lots of juniors, intermediates, and seniors, front end, back end, full stack. We also do lots of mentorship as well. So if you're a senior who's looking to do some mentorship or you want to get into some leadership, we're a great company to join. So really glad Kent's here with us today. I haven't seen him in a while. So it's really nice for him to be here with us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me again.
Yes, I hope to see you again in person soon.
Yeah, seriously, like I enjoy seeing your face on my screen, but it's a lot more fun in person.
Yes, maybe. I know last year we said maybe next year, but maybe next year.
Maybe this year
for sure.
It can happen this year.
Yeah.
It's not really a big secret that RemixConf is going to be a thing this year. We just haven't officially announced it. So come to Utah.
Well, that could work. I wouldn't mind.
Do it. It'll be fun.
I could use a vacation.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. I'll drag Ian along, or maybe he'll drag me along. We'll see. No. For anybody who doesn't know Kent, he's a world-renowned speaker, teacher, and trainer. He's very active in the open source community as a maintainer and contributor of hundreds of popular NPM packages. He's the creator of EpicReact.Dev and testingjavascript.com. He's an instructor on egghead.io and Frontend Masters. He's also a Google developer expert. I didn't know that. Kent is happily married and the father of 4 kids. So he likes his family, code, JavaScript, and React. Fun fact, when I met Kent, he told me he was a JavaScript dev, and I cringed.
That's right. I remember that. That was great.
How long ago was that?
Amsterdam 2020 or 2018? 2019, maybe?
19? I think 2019, yeah.
Yeah,
a couple years ago. And he's like, "Oh, I'll follow you on Twitter." And I was like, I'm not on Twitter. And that sparked a whole train of events, and now I'm on Twitter. So yeah, it's just, yeah, I guess that was almost 3 years ago now. Time flies when you're having fun.
Or when you're having COVID.
Yeah, that's true. So for anybody who has not joined the Platform Calgary Discord server, we're going to be networking thereafter. But I think when Kent's done his talk, if we have some time left, we'll take some questions from the chat. Mm-hmm. There's the YouTube chat and there's also the Twitch chat. So I'll be keeping an eye on those, and there are a couple of people moderating there as well. And when Kent starts speaking, I will drop the Discord invite link in those chats as well, so you guys have an opportunity to come chat with us after.
Yeah, I should probably join the Discord there too, actually. So then I can join in the fun.
or if you want to drop, did you want to drop your Discord link?
Yeah. So I mean, I
can drop that one as well for anybody who wants it, so that you're not interrupted.
Super. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Works for you. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we've got the Remix Discord as well, which would be a good one to put in there. You can find that on the Remix website.
Okay, I'll look for that, and I'll make sure that I'll share that with everyone. So
sweet.
I'll let you take it away.
All right. Awesome. So I told Ian and Serene that the reason my veins are popping out of my skull is because I was just playing indoor soccer and or football, as it is properly called. Yeah. So anyway, I'm like breathing hard and like it's hard to even laugh. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and we can get started. The first thing that I wanted to mention. Oh, Serene, I think I need you to. Oh, thank you. You are on it, or Ian, whoever it was. Thank you. The first thing I wanted to mention is we are also hiring at Remix, and so if you want to go to rmx.as/jobs, and that'll take you to this page. And we'd love to talk to you if you want to join us. It's awesome working here. I loved Remix so much that I decided to leave my full-time on my own, doing my own thing, to join with a group of engineers, and they're awesome. Okay, so we are here to talk about Remix, and I'm so excited because Remix is just fantastic. I was happily doing my own thing as a full-time educator with EpicReact.Dev and testing JavaScript and like speaking at conferences about React and whatever. And then Remix came along. And well, the pandemic hit and Ryan was like, hey, we got to like pivot and figure out something, Ryan Florence and Michael Jackson. And so they started building this framework, and they would show it to me every now and then and be like, hey, Kent, what do you think about this? And I would give feedback on the APIs and things. And then when the developer preview was released, I was like super on board. I was so excited. And a few months later, I started rewriting my website to Remix. And over the few months that I spent building it, I just, man, this thing is so awesome. I was so happy with it, and decided that all I wanted to do was teach people how to build Remix apps, because my personal mission is to help people make the world a better place through quality software. And I can't think of a better way to do that than by teaching people how to use Remix. And so it's like, all I want to do is teach people how to build Remix apps. And talked with Ryan and Michael, and they're like, hey, we'd love you to do that here and make everything that you do for free. I was like, that sounds great for everybody involved. And so that is what I do. I'm the director of developer experience at Remix, and I'm so excited about it. So what is Remix? Let's talk about this. Remix is a web framework with a laser focus on the user experience and web foundations. So this is an example of what a Remix route module looks like, and we'll be referencing this code as we go along. This is actually, these are not slides. This is the Remix website, remix.run. But Ryan put this thing together with a designer, and they did such a great job that they double his slides. So that's what we're going to be using today to talk about some of the things that, that we're doing. So if we come down here, I'm going to skip over a couple of things. We'll get back to that. I want to talk about the history of building websites on the web, and what it's been like for since the web was born, what that experience was like. So and again, like Remix is super focused on the user experience, and so that's what I'm going to be focused on in my remarks. I'm also going to stand up. One second. It's just a bit more comfortable to stand. So when you go to a URL on the web, the first thing that happens is the DNS servers will look at that URL and convert it into an IP address. And then that is how you find the server that's going to respond to the request from your browser. And typically, the server is going to respond with HTML. And in the world of the modern web, that HTML is going to differ based on who is requesting the HTML. So it's like, think about like a banking website, or your email account or whatever. Your the experience that you have is unique to you, and that's where like most of the valuable web is these days, is how do we make an application that's useful for a particular user. So that process that time between when the browser makes the request, when you say, okay, this is the URL I want to go to, and the server sending the HTML that the browser can display, there's stuff going on there that takes longer than an instant. And so what does the user experience during that time period? Well, back like 15 years ago, what the user experienced was just this white screen. And this is one thing we'll never be able to get away from, with the exception of like, once a service worker's installed and stuff. But we're talking about users never been at your app before, maybe, or they decided to clear their cache or something. So in that situation, we're going to have a white screen that we're just waiting for. And that worked out pretty well for a while until users started demanding faster experiences. Like they would close the tab if it took too long to get to your online store, and you have like an actual amount of, or like problem with users exiting before they could actually check out and buy your, I don't know, your plush koalas or something. So this became a problem, and we wanted to give the user some sort of indication that we are processing this request. And so the browsers actually did this. They added a little spinner in the favicon area, and they would have like maybe an indication down here to say what resource they're waiting for, whatever, just to give the user some idea that like, hey, we are doing stuff. We're not just sitting around doing nothing. This white screen doesn't mean that your app is broken. But still, that wasn't great, because even if that took a while, the user thought that it was taking too long, and so they would leave. And so we decided, hey, we've been doing this thing called using a CDN for our static assets. So these are the assets that don't take into account who the user is. So we're talking about CSS, images, JavaScript, that sort of thing. And so we're putting that onto a CDN because it doesn't matter who the user is. It's totally irrelevant. And so we can just put a bunch of servers all over the world, get those servers as close to our users as possible, so that when the user says, hey, I need this JavaScript file, it just finds the server that's closest to it, and that server can send it back. Because there's only so many things that you can do when with like regard to getting rid of that or shortening this loading time. And so one of those things is just to locate your servers really close to the user. And so because we'd already done that, we thought, hey, what if we, instead of generating the HTML, what if we, on every request, what if we generate something that's common for all users, just some sort of shell for our application, and send that instead. And so for a long time, that shell was like basically just a loading spinner for lots of applications. And this is the Create React App sort of thing. Hi, Ian. That's kind of the approach there, is let's have like a really basic shell, and you could take your index HTML there and like make it be a real shell of your app. You could take it a step further and do static site generation, where you can do like most of your app pre-render that stuff. And then anything that's user specific, you just have loading spinners. And so this worked out pretty well, because you could at least give the user some sort of response a lot faster than waiting for the request to go all the way to the origin server to go get the HTML and send it all the way back. And also, like, potentially it could be that your origin server was slow and didn't scale very well or something. So so this worked out like pretty well. The problem though was that for a lot of applications, the shell is basically useless. All that it's there for is just to communicate to the user that something's happening, but it's not giving the user anything very useful. And then the other big problem is as a result of another optimization that we did later. So the other problem that we ran into was our clients got really, really big. We just stuffed a bunch of JavaScript into them. They got really, really big. And then we decided, hey, like a user going to the login screen doesn't actually need the settings page yet. Like maybe they're going to the settings page eventually, but they don't need to download that yet. So there's no reason that, or like the dashboard, there's no reason that we need to bring all of D3 in for the login screen. So let's just chunk this up into little bite-sized chunks. So we just send the code that's necessary for the login screen, and then all of these other screens can be loaded on demand later. And then another thing that we did was we said, hey, it's really hard to write an application at scale when you have like your data requirements over here and your code that requires it over here. So let's put those two things together. And so now you combine those two requirements, those two desires, like what you're trying to get, and what you're left with is the situation where you have to go get the code on demand after you know what code to get in the first place. And once you get the code, you have to evaluate, parse it, all that stuff, evaluate it. And then that says, oh, actually, I happen to know that I need to get some data. And oh, interestingly, I also have to get some other code that was split. And so you're getting code that was split. And then once that comes back, you get the data that it needs. And you end up with this waterfall effect, which presents us with this user experience that we see all over the web. So take a look at this. Ignore this side for a second. We'll look at that in a little bit. Just focus on this without remix experience and try to think of an app that you used recently that gave you this experience. So first, we load the document, we get the white screen, we get the spinner, and then we get a bump where the spinner moves. So now we've loaded some part of the UI. We get another bump, we've loaded that part of the UI, another bump, and then we're waiting for that part of the UI. And this loading experience of things popping into place is common everywhere. And I don't care how much money you've got at your company, you have, we've got a lot of places like this that are not good. So one example of this is Twitter. So you've got loading spinners all over the place, even on a refresh. So they're not caching this stuff. They're giving us this loader experience, this loading experience. Every single time we come on this page. And like, I'm not even slowing down the network. If you've got a bad network experience, then things like pop in at random points in time. The other thing is, I think I will probably need to slow down my network here to simulate this correctly. But if I go down to even a fast 3G connection, and if I go to YouTube, just the other day, I went to YouTube. Here's our skeleton that we're all probably familiar with. And we wait and we wait and wait. And we're like, well, at least we know something's coming. And then we say Studio C, because I love Studio. Wait a second. I hit Studio C. Okay, great. It works that time. So what happened there was on this first like full page refresh on a network that's like relatively slow. Well, I should probably type something that's a little faster to type, but hopefully you notice that. I typed something in, I hit enter, and my search was cleared. The app wasn't ready. The JavaScript wasn't ready yet. And the user experience was not great. So we end up with not only loading spinners popping into place with the skeleton UI, but also if we try to render something that's like semi-useful or looks like it's ready, we're not actually ready. And that is not a great user experience. Spoiler alert, Remix, if YouTube used Remix, it would not have that problem. And it wouldn't need, they don't need to do anything special for them to not have that problem. It's just the way you use Remix. So we've got a number of problems with the way that we build apps today. But remember, we're not just doing this just because we like giving the users like a bad spinning loading experience. We're doing it because we didn't like the experience of this white screen for an extended period of time. And so we've been doing this for a number of years. And while we've been waiting, doing all of this loading spinner stuff, this white screen has been getting shorter and shorter and shorter, or we're able to make it take shorter and shorter time, where we actually don't need to give the user a useless loading state anymore. We can actually give them the entire app. And this is thanks to a lot of modern infrastructure. So I'm talking about things like Cloudflare Workers and Cloudflare Pages. Fastly has, I need to remember what their thing is called, but Fastly has something like this. AWS Lambda at Edge. And then Fly.io also does stuff like this. Dino Deploy, they're currently in beta. They do something like this, where they distribute your app and your data all over the world. AWS has their DynamoDB thing. There's FaunaDB for distributing your data all over the world. So you just push everything to where that CDN was. Remember, the reason we thought, oh, hey, we could do this is because we could push that to the CDN and make it happen really fast. Well, what if you can push all of your entire code to the CDN? That's basically what these companies are doing. And by doing this, we can give the user a really fast, like 250 milliseconds or less experience. Here, I'm going to do a live demo. So hopefully this goes well. But if I do a empty cache and hard reload here, then I got 1 second. That's actually the longest I've ever seen it take. Here we go. 319 milliseconds on my site, which is built with Remix. And my site is not static. every single time you refresh, these blog posts are different. And they are specific to me because I'm logged in. So it's not something that I could just cache via HTTP or something. This is all loading really fast because I'm hosting on Fly. It'd be even faster if I were hosting on Cloudflare Workers, where they have, I've literally got a server up the street in Salt Lake that's really, really close to me. So Cloudflare, if you look at Cloudflare, and I kind of pick on Cloudflare because they are doing such a great job of it, but there are other companies that are doing this. But if you go to cloudflare.com/network, I love this. 50 milliseconds from 95% of the world's internet connected population. Now, we think that's cool for the CDN aspect of it, but it's if you can actually run real actual code there, that's even cooler, because it means that you don't need to put static assets there. You can put your whole server right there. That is really, really awesome. One of the benefits of what I'm doing here with hosting this on Fly is this is a full node server, whereas Cloudflare is like its own JavaScript runtime environment. But you can run Remix in Cloudflare. So anyway, the point is that with modern infrastructure, this problem that we had is no longer a problem. And we can eliminate this problem. And now we don't have to have this terrible loading experience anymore. And Remix is especially well suited for managing or for solving this particular problem of that white screen. And so let's put a loading spinner in front of everybody's faces. So that's the whole thing. Like, we want to say goodbye to Spinageddon because it is the worst. It literally is the worst. Like, seriously, go to your banking website and count how many spinners there are. There will be many. Or maybe it's still like 15 years old. And so maybe you're waiting for like 5 seconds with a white screen. So they can skip the whole SSG thing and go straight to Remix if they ever upgrade. So that's like the biggest aha thing about Remix from the user's perspective, is we're eliminating that loading jank. But it's not just for like, okay, let's build websites the way we used to with modern infrastructure. No. Remix is about way more than that too, because of the way that Remix is built, and because of nested routes, which we'll talk about later. Remix has the ability to make it feel like your app is installed on the user's machine, with not only the code for it, but also the data, because Remix understands your data requirements as well as your code and your CSS and your fonts and whatever else. It understands all of that, and it can prefetch everything as the user is interacting with the app. And so here, as the user says, hey, I'm going to go click on this invoice right here, we can prefetch all of this stuff. And as soon as the user clicks on it, it's already there in the browser cache. And so it shows up instantly. And we are literally just using link tags to do this. So this is like built into the platform. You actually can do this with Webpack. They have this magic comment thing, but you have to do all of that manually. Remix makes this sort of thing really, really easy. And on top of that, you don't have to wait for JavaScript to be loaded before this. Well, actually, no. For this, you do have to wait for JavaScript to be loaded. But we do add prefetch link tags to the HTML output. So yeah, in that situation, actually you don't. And what's actually really cool about this too is that by using link tags and using the platform like this, then even if the user like mouses over this and they download all this stuff and they say, you know what, never mind, I'm going to close it. And they're like, no, never mind again. I actually do want to open that up. And so they open the browser again and click on it really quick. It's in the browser cache. They just close the whole app and open it up again, and that cache is still around. Most people, when they try to do this sort of thing, are putting their data in some sort of global store or something like that, and that is in memory. And now, not only do you have to have the code for all of that, so it means that your entire app takes longer to load, but also when the user closes the tab, that's completely gone. And so if they open the tab again, you have to reload it, whether it be like, oh, now I have to think about storing it in IndexedDB, or I actually literally have to make these requests again to go get that prefetch stuff, that data into my in-memory cache. The other problem that you run into when you start scaling that is now we have a memory management problem, and we have to think about garbage collection. With Remix, we solve this problem for you, And we solve it by using the platform where the browser already is managing, when to let go of the cache and memory management and all of that stuff. So there's no code to ship for that. It's pretty simple from both the Remix side as well as your side, which is pretty sick, my friends. It is awesome. And you'll notice that like this is prefetching not only the JavaScript again, but it's also getting all of the data that is necessary for this navigation as well. So like we are really committed to getting rid of loading states. We think that loading states are important and you need to have them just in case the user's network is really bad or slow or whatever. But we can make it so that most of your users never see those loading states, which is a much better user experience. Okay, let's talk about like some specifics of loading the data. And then I want to talk about mutating the data. So let's go up to the top again. Each route module in your app has what's called a loader. And so your route module has the default export. This is the UI that's being displayed, but you got to get your data from somewhere. And you manage that in a separate export called the loader. This loader runs server-side only. And so that means you can access your database. You can use private keys. You can do like whatever finagling thing you want to do. It all works because it actually runs on the server. And then Remix bridges that gap between the client and the server to give you that data, so you don't have to think about those loading states in places where it doesn't make sense. And so here on the projects, we just say, give me the projects or get me the loader data, which is just these projects up here. And then we can render those things out. So that's really a nice way to load data. It means that you can put in GraphQL if you want to, but you actually don't really need to, because remember, one of the big reasons why people got excited about GraphQL was because we had the data overfetching and underfetching problems. So underfetching means that you're not getting enough data. And so now you have to go change your server code so that you can get some more data. And that's really annoying and whatever. With this, if you're not getting enough data, you literally just like go into the loader and get the data that you need, which is just, it's right there. And so like there isn't a problem with underfetching. And with overfetching, if you're sending too much, you literally just like pluck out the stuff you don't need in your loader because that runs on the server. So like I don't care if you're getting like tons of stuff from some third-party API. That's all happening on your server anyway. For example, on my site, if you go to the Chats with Kent podcast, then here I've, which by the way, Serene is on, I can't remember. Yeah, Ian's right here on this season. I think Serene was on season 1, maybe. Anyway, Serene's on one of these seasons too. And Ian got 2 episodes. We just had so much to talk about. But the API that I'm using for this is Simplecast. And Simplecast API requires you to call like 6 different endpoints. And it gives you a silly amount of data. And I can just slim that down to just the stuff that I need for this particular page. And then I have this page requires or exposes a little bit more data. And so I can have this page load even more of that data. And so I have complete control over all of that stuff because I can control that in the loader and that runs on my server. So no longer do you need GraphQL for only requesting the data that you need. You can still totally use GraphQL. There are other reasons that people like GraphQL, but you don't need it to solve that problem because you don't have that problem with Remix. And I think that's pretty great. Another important aspect of this is that GraphQL in particular, but other fetching libraries can be quite heavy from a kilobyte standpoint. And so because this all is happening on the server, you don't need to send that GraphQL library to the browser. GraphQL, if you're not aware, is enormous. It is way bigger than even React DOM. So yeah, it's very big. So it's really nice to be able to say, hey, I don't need to send that to the browser. I can just manage all that on the server. So really, really cool thing there. But let's talk about forms or mutations, because it's kind of an important part of building web apps. And a lot of frameworks just kind of like leave you off on your own to manage mutations. So yeah. And the problem with mutations is when you make a mutation, how do you get all of the data that's on the page up to date? And that's like been the big question for the last 6 years of React. And so that's where like Flux pattern came around and Redux and everything. So much complexity for just updating data and making sure that everything on the screen is what it should be based on that. Remix completely eliminates this problem. And it does this by using a form. So you can actually, with Remix, you can use a regular form without prevent default, do the full page refresh and all of that stuff that worked 15 years ago without JavaScript, and it will work. Remix understands regular form submissions. But because we do have JavaScript most of the time, you can use this special form component. I should probably bump that up a little bit. Sorry about that. Here we are. You can use this special form component from Remix, and that can enhance things a fair amount. So this is where you get progressive enhancement. Works without this particular feature, works better with this particular feature. That particular feature is JavaScript. So you have your form, you have your inputs, you have your button. And as soon as the user clicks that button, it's going to get submitted, and the Remix server will get that request, and it will call your action. And it's going to call your action with this request, which is a web fetch request object. And so if you want to learn, okay, what is that request object that I get in my action or in my loader? You're not going to the Remix docs. You're going to the Mozilla Developer Network, or where your favorite web platform documentation site, the spec, if you want to, because that's what we're using. And so the better that you get at Remix, the better you get at the web platform, because you're using so many of these web platform APIs, which I think is pretty sweet. This is actually one of the things I like about React, is the better I get at React, the better I get at JavaScript. Remix is that for me, just for the web platform. So anyway, your action gets the request. You can pluck the form data off of that. Again, web standard API. And then you can do whatever you want to with it. This runs on the server, so you can use private keys. You can hit a database directly, whatever you need. And then you say, give it back a response of what you want it to do. And redirects are a pretty common response. And so we have a utility for that. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And again, it works without JavaScript, which is neat. But we can do some really cool things when you do have JavaScript. Like, instead of doing a full page refresh, Remix will automatically revalidate everything for you. So when this post request goes out, then Remix is like, okay, sweet, that post request was sent and it was successful. So let me go ahead and revalidate all of the data that's on the page. Because that's what the browser does before, like without JavaScript, the browser says, okay, let me do this post, and then I'll take whatever HTML the server gives me. We don't send them back HTML from our actions. We just send a response. But Remix basically simulates the same thing with or without JavaScript. It's going to say, okay, all of the data on here, all bets are off on this. You did a mutation. Who knows what changed? Let's just go get everything. And of course, you can like opt out of that, kind of like a memoization in React. But most of the time, you don't really need to. You just go ahead and get everything that's on the page. And what's really cool, though, is Remix will automatically handle race conditions and resubmissions for you. So if the user is like checking off to do, and they're like, actually, never mind, I want to check that back on or whatever, then Remix will cancel those GET requests and do that next post for you. And when that post is successful, it'll do new GET requests. So you never have to think about race conditions. You don't have to think about keeping the state on the page up to date with what's in the backend. It's on your server or whatever, your database. Remix will make sure that the data that's on the page is always the latest and greatest of what, based on whatever mutations happened. So this is actually an enormous chunk of all of your time that you spend building web apps is dedicated to these problems, and you don't have them with Remix. They don't exist. You do not have these problems with Remix. Just yesterday, I tweeted that, or maybe it was a couple days ago, I tweeted that when I'm using Remix, I feel like my Redux store is actually the database, which is where it should be. So I don't think about some sort of store to like keep in sync with the backend or whatever. It's just not a thing you think about. And it's brilliant. It's awesome. This is one of the things that really won me over to Remix, if you couldn't tell. I love this feature. On top of this, showing pending states is also quite useful and nice because we have this use transition hook. This is not the React use transition hook. That's not released yet. It's not real. Not yet. This is a Remix use transition hook, and this will tell you when there's a transition going on the page. And so here, if we're submitting a form, then we can say, hey, we're creating the invoice in our button. But we can actually do even better, because this transition also has the form inputs that the user just submitted. So it has the form submission. And so what if you take, in our case, if we're like creating a new invoice, we're going to send the user to the new invoice page. So we create that invoice, we get the ID, and we send them to that URL. So if that's what we're doing, then what if we take the component that's on that page and we extract it into an invoice component that accepts an invoice, or at least data for an invoice? And then we render that in our invoice page. And then before we finish navigating, so before the submission is over, while that submission is in flight, we can actually render that invoice with the data they just gave us. So we know what the company name and the amount for that invoice was. So we can render that invoice and make it look like that page is already ready. Like the user's already submitted, it's already been saved, and the request has been finished. And that can be instant. This is called optimistic UI. It's not, Remix did not invent this, but I'd be very surprised if you could show me an easier way to do optimistic UI, because the big challenge with optimistic UI is what happens if that request actually ends up failing. And most of the time you have some sort of error rollback that you have to think about when you're doing optimistic UI. In Remix, you don't, because you haven't actually finished the navigation yet. So you're still on the page with the new invoice form. And if that submission fails, then you just go right back to the form. And then you can show your error messages or whatever you need to based on the response. So this is brilliant. What I love about Remix is that it makes doing the better thing for the user really easy. And this is one of those things that is really great for the user experience. And it's like, look at that. Just look at that. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I love that. It's really cool. HTML forms. Who knew? Okay, so before I continue to the, I've got like 2 last things that I want to talk about. Then I can do questions. I forgot to ask how much time I had. So hopefully I'm not taking way more time than you were expecting. Feel free to interrupt me. And I will not feel bad or offended or anything, because it was my bad. I forgot to ask how much time I had. Okay, so I want to talk about nested routes. So this part impacts the user experience quite significantly, but it's more obvious how this impacts the developer experience. That's why I'm talking about it later, because the user experience is paramount. Developer experience is also important, but not as much. Okay, so let's talk about how we structure our components on the page. For other frameworks you might be familiar with, like Gatsby and Next, they have this pages directory, and all of your route modules live inside of that. But each one of those route modules is responsible for the entire page when that route is active, not just the section of the page that route is relevant for, but the entire page. So for example, here we have example.com/sales/invoices/10/2000. And with that, you would have like a sales invoices and then the params thing, invoice ID. So that invoice ID route that's like all the way nested in the file structure is not nested from the UI perspective, and it will be responsible for rendering the left nav and the top nav and the list of invoices and all of that stuff. And so this is why it's really common in those apps to have sorry, just like totally blanked, have layout route components, where this layout component is responsible for rendering all of the stuff that's common for all of these layouts. So what's with Remix, the routes are nested not only in the file structure, but also in the way that they're rendered onto the page. So here we have 4 routes on here. One is that was weird. Oh, okay, never mind. One is the root route, and that's responsible for rendering just the entire shell of the application. And what this is going to render is our left nav, and it will render what's called an outlet. And this is a feature in React Router v6, which, by the way, React Router v6 or Remix is basically React Router v6 fully realized. So a lot of React Router v6 in Remix. So the root renders the left nav, and then it renders an outlet. And then the sales will render the top nav here, and then an outlet. And then our invoices will render this data, and then the invoice list, and then an outlet. And then our invoice doesn't have any children. This is the leaf route, and all it renders is the data for this invoice. And so that is reflected in those route modules. And so when we're up here at the root route, we're not thinking anything about the invoice ID at all. We don't need to worry about loading that data or anything. And we're down here in the invoice ID route. We're not thinking anything about loading the user so we know what links they can see or whatever. We're 100% just focused on the part of the UI that our route is responsible for. So this has really great implications from a developer experience standpoint. Your route modules, super clean, really productive. And then for the user experience side of things, as the user is interacting with the web app, Remix knows exactly which of your route module loaders it should be loading data for. And so if I were to switch which of these invoices that I have selected, Remix knows that it doesn't need to go reload the data for any of this stuff. It knows that it can just reload the data for this particular route. And so it ends up being a lot faster and better for the user. And again, we're like prefetching all this stuff too. So yeah, it is great working with nested routes. Really awesome. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about, and this is pretty relevant with nested routes as well, is down here. Sometimes we have errors, and errors, you can't avoid these things. So in React, the way that we handle errors is with error boundaries, and in Remix we have route error boundaries. So the problem with error boundaries in React is they are scoped to a specific component. And that, which is fine. You can totally use React error boundaries in Remix, but the problem is that they don't work on the server. So if you're rendering your app and there's some sort of explosion as you're rendering your app, that explodes the entire request. And so you have to at some point catch that and somehow reconstruct parts of the app that make sense. But most of the time we don't. Most of the time we don't even think about it, and you end up just showing like a useless page to your user and say something went wrong. Sorry. That is not good enough. That's not a good enough user experience. So with Remix, we have route error boundaries that work on the server, and they will handle errors that happen in your loaders as well. So loading data, your error boundaries will handle that as well. And these are for your unexpected errors. We also have another API for expected errors, like 404s and 401s, and all those like client errors is what those are called, the 400 space stuff. And so we have a catch boundary for that. But for the error boundary, all that you do is you export a function called error boundary. And if there's an error in rendering your component or in loading your data, then this is going to get rendered in its place. And what that means, because we have nested routing, is that it shows up in like contextually in where that component would have gone. And that may not be exciting to you because you're like, yeah, that's how error boundaries work. But no, this works on the server render also. And so even if something weird goes wrong with your JavaScript or whatever, or like maybe there's a data problem here, and so you could never possibly load this page because there's some problem with the data, in Remix you can. It will work. And so the user can like this has an actual impact on the experience of not only your users, but also the people who listen to complaints from your users. Because now, instead of saying, hey, your app is broken, the user can say, hey, I noticed that when I select this particular invoice, it's busted, but other invoices work fine. I can click around to the other ones and it's no big deal. I can navigate all over the place. Everything else works. It's just this one, whenever I see that, I just get this oh snap thing. So I don't know what's up. So the reports to your support people are much more helpful, and the whole experience is just way better. And this is just the way that it works. You don't have to do anything special here other than think about the errors and handle those. Because if you don't, then we'll just bubble up to the least common error boundary, which is also quite nice. And we have the same sort of user experience for the expected errors. So if you said, hey, you don't have access to this particular invoice, you're going to throw a 401 or a 403 or whatever the case is, then we'll just render that. You can throw that response, and then we'll handle that and render your catch boundary where you can say, hey, yo, you don't have access to this thing. How can you even see it? Like, I don't know what's going on. And that also, of course, works on the server render. So much like super awesome user experience there. So that's everything that the home screen shows you and tells you about. Hopefully I didn't take more time than was expected, but if you can't tell, I love Remix, and I just want you all to use it because I think it's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kent. That was great. I like how your demo is just the Remix website.
Yeah, it's awesome, right?
It is, yeah. That nested route stuff is quite cool as well.
Yeah, that it is just awesome to develop with, and we can give a user experience that is second to none as well. So
I like that you're kind of bringing back the whole concept of like progressive enhancement. I feel like we kind of lost that in sort of the transition to like pure JavaScript client side apps. You know, if you don't, I mean, you mentioned Create React App. If you load a Create React app without JavaScript, it's just one line of text that says, please enable JavaScript.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was a big fan of progressive enhancement at the time, and it's nice to see it go back.
Yeah. Well, and another thing with that too is like, it's not like we're saying, well, people run around with JavaScript disabled. Like, that's not what it is. And I know you know that, but it's also the app works before the JavaScript loads. And so even if you do, for some weird reason, have a silly amount of JavaScript that you're loading, like actually here, I think it's safe for me to show you this. Oh, here, let me pull this over here for a second to make sure, because maybe it would not be good. But Sentry does something that I think is kind of funny when they load your app. Okay, yeah, this is just my Discord bot. I don't think that it's showing any any keys or anything. But yeah, if I do a full refresh on Sentry, here, maybe my internet connection is too fast. I just think this is cute. Yeah, please wait while we load an obnoxious amount of JavaScript. I just think that, I mean, I'm glad for them for at least acknowledging the reality of what they're doing.
Right.
But even if you do load an obnoxious amount of JavaScript, if you're using Remix, the entire app will work before that JavaScript's finished loading, because the Remix server understands how forms work. And so even if the JavaScript hasn't loaded, your forms, all of your mutations, everything will work while the user's getting all that stuff loaded. So right. The progressive enhancement is strong here.
That YouTube example you showed was pretty bad, where as the page is loading, you type in your search query and it just disappears. Yeah. Nothing happens. That is not a great user experience.
They just are banking on people not being able to type fast enough or something. I don't know.
We've got a couple questions here in the chat that I'll ask you, and to everyone watching, if you have a question you want to ask, please post it and I'll ask Kent. So first question here is about CSS, and does Remix have any kind of opinion on preferring pure CSS or something like Tailwind versus CSS in JS?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's like one of the many things that we didn't get to talk about. Like, I didn't talk about cookies and sessions and a bunch of other things like styles that Remix handles for you. And so Remix does a really great job of managing CSS from a style sheet perspective. So like going back to the way that we used to do things before we had all these problems and decided to use CSS and JS to solve those problems. So you will run into the problems that led us to CSS and JS a lot later in developing a full-scale application. And so, yeah, we manage style sheets really, really nicely. The short version is basically you can have each one of these route modules can specify a group of link tags, which is how you get styles on the page. And so you say, hey, I have this style sheet. And those link tags will be on the page when that route is active and off the page when it's not. And so because of that property, like the reason we ran into like, hey, let's use CSS and JS is because everybody was just concatenating their CSS and putting everything on one page. And because it was silly to have like 100 CSS files on the page, because especially at the time, we didn't have HTTP2, so you couldn't parallelize that. You'd have like 6 to 8 requests at a time. So like that just doesn't work. And then of course also like it's just not awesome to do that. And so we would just concatenate it all together. But this meant that every single change that you made in any CSS file would impact every page of your app. With Remix, that is not the case because you can specify, I want this style sheet on this page, period. And I never worry about it impacting other pages. That said, at scale, you do run into situations where like, well, I mean, I've got this style for my dropdown and I have dropdowns on like almost every page. So now that needs to be a global thing. And so you're kind of back in the same place. Luckily, like that's kind of a natural thing to namespace anyway. So you typically don't run into clashes for component styles. But still, it's not as awesome an experience. And so we are actually in the process of adding good abstractions for component level styling. You can use CSS and JS with Remix. I guess I should say that. We also are huge fans of Tailwind, and you can Tailwind is on this site and it's on my site. But yeah, we're going to be adding even more stuff for component level CSS as well.
All right. Let's see. Next question here from Neil C. again. If he's asking if he chooses to use something like Axios for data fetching because maybe he needs, say, upload progress, does that interfere with Remix's built-in data fetching?
No, it does not. So, and you might want to like click on it so it shows up in our video. Click on that question. There we go. Yeah. So no, that would work fine. You can totally use Axios if you want to. You can do progress with fetch. So actually, I guess I should specify or talk about this. So if you use Axios within your loader, then that is fine. If you are loading data on the client, then we use a hook called useFetcher that allows you to fetch data. And of course, you can always use your own use effect thing, whatever, and that totally works. The problem is that there's no built-in mechanism for refetching that when there's a mutation, and so you have to manage that yourself. There will eventually be support for getting progress on a request with something like useFetcher. Ryan talked about it a while ago, so that will eventually be a thing. But yeah, right now, so if you want to have progress on a network request for like a loader or something, then the current solution is basically do the same thing you do in your app today, and we're going to make it better in Remix in the future. Okay.
I really liked, by the way, the form submission and how you kind of just handle like, you know, duplicate submissions and that kind of thing. That's really slick as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that.
Less work that you have to do as a dev.
Yes.
Another question here. First, this is really awesome. Curious if you consider Remix to be a React framework or more of a JavaScript framework.
Yeah, great question. It is 100% a web framework. It's not even a Node framework because it runs in Cloudflare Workers, and that's Node environment. Also can run in Deno soon. We have run it in Deno with a couple extra like little hacks you have to do, and very soon it will run officially in Deno. That's to be clear. But yeah, so it's not a Node framework per se. Like you can use it in Node, of course. And it's certainly not just a React framework. Right now we use React. Eventually, you could totally use Vue. In fact, early on with Remix, somebody got it working with Vue. And so like basically what you need to get like actual support for these frameworks is a framework agnostic router with just like adapters so that you could have these different hooks for the routers. But yeah, that's not like a huge priority for us because React is still like 3 times almost as widely used as all of the other frameworks combined. So like clearly we need to focus, and React is one of those things we can just focus on right now. But yeah, we have a very obvious path forward for making it more framework agnostic from the Vue library side. But so much of what Remix is the server aspect, and that is completely framework agnostic.
It's been really interesting seeing over the last year or two things like Cloudflare Workers and other edge computing platforms like that kind of gaining popularity, and also I think you mentioned as well, you're seeing edge kind of database tools becoming popular. It's interesting timing with the rise of those kinds of things, and then something like Remix comes along. Was that kind of a happy accident, or?
I know that because of Cloudflare Workers choosing Service Worker as their API, that was something that Michael was thinking about a lot. Was just like, man, that's really interesting. And so it became a priority from like really early on with Remix to do a similar thing and just say, hey, what if we just make our server aspect function like it's like regular web tech, modern web tech, using those standards rather than like node specific stuff. And so, yeah, Cloudflare Workers was a target from, pretty much from the beginning. And like, because of that, we'll eventually have service worker support. And so in that world, like some people are sitting here like, well, I don't want to run a server. And yeah, I can understand that. Like, there's no reason, I personally feel like you can give a much better user experience if you do run a server. But if you don't want to, then you can run Remix inside of a service worker in the future. Right now, this is not a priority right now, but there is a very obvious path for us to do that in the future, and then you won't have to run a server. You can just put it in the service worker.
That's interesting because that is one of the things Create React App has going for it is, you can make a website and drop it in an S3 bucket or any kind of file hosting, and not have to worry about running that server. So I guess you guys are going to put us out of business once you ship all those features.
Does that make you sad, Ian, or are you kind of like hopeful?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good to see the web and the like platform kind of evolving, right? Sometimes it's time for things to change, right? So that part makes me happy.
Yeah,
happy to see the progress and stuff.
There are mixed feelings when, I totally get it.
I guess one other question just for me quickly about the Edge kind of database aspect. So I guess if you were to combine this with like just a regular kind of traditional database that was like hosted in one place, you would lose, I guess, a lot of those performance benefits, right? You'd still have the code at the edge, but then you're still going back to that central kind of server for your data, right?
Yeah. So when I was building my website, I wasn't even thinking about this a lot, but like I got it in my mind that I really wanted my website to be screaming fast. And that was a sticking point for me. So like I started with my authentication with Firebase, and I realized really quickly if I did that, then I'd have to go to US East 1 or wherever I ended up hosting my authentication for every request. And I was like, that's not like, I'm using fly.io so I can put my app in a bunch of regions all over the world. And so, I decided, let's hand roll my own authentication so that I can make things fast and distribute the data. So one nice thing about using something like Cloudflare or Fly or whatever, one of these others, is that once you get to the cloud provider or your hosting provider, then their network connection is like crazy, screaming fast. And so you're way better still doing server rendering and having all the requests happening on the server that has a really fast connection than having the user be responsible with their network connection to go make all these data requests. So you're still a lot better because like Remix will manage that for you really nicely. But yeah, you're right. It is that like there are tiers here, and the top tier is put your data and your rendering at the edge.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean Cloudflare or whoever, they're going to have a very fast connection to AWS or the rest of the internet. But for best results, I think we're probably going to see the rise of a lot more tools. Someone needs to build a authentication library at the edge, or
we've got it. Yeah, you can totally. You mean like a host, like a third party in it? Yeah, like an Auth0 at the edge or something.
Right.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a whole rise of tools, both from like existing, like Cloudflare. I know they're just cranking out the stuff lately. So I think we'll probably start to see a bunch of stuff coming from providers like them, and then but also potentially like other startups building edge versions of things.
Yep.
There's one more question here. I'm not sure if this is. Another question from Neil. I guess this is kind of related to data at the edge. There are concerns with eventual consistency among different instances. Will people see the same data upon mutations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was concerned about this. In my experience with Postgres on the edge with Fly, I've got read replicas all over the world. And I was like, man, like user updates some data, and then they, because like you have read replicas and then you have your primary database. And so my primary database is in Dallas. And so if I have a user in Amsterdam, they are going to go and update Dallas, and then they're going to come back and say, okay, now I want to read in Amsterdam. Well, and then Fly is responsible for replicating that right to all of the other databases. And it's so magic. I don't even think about it. It's amazing how they make that work. I don't know how it works. It's so cool. So they can do that in like 10 milliseconds. It is wildly fast. So I have not had problems with this. With the exception of, actually, no, that was something else. So no, I haven't had problems with this. The thing is that most of the time, and that's actually just a limitation with Fly. I believe with Cloudflare Workers, I actually don't know the implementation, so I shouldn't say that. But anyway, it's wildly fast. And most of the time we're doing reads, and so that's what we want to optimize for. And then there is, oh shoot, there was one, I just heard about this today. There is a service coming out or something, like people are working on this problem to drastically reduce the consistency problem. Actually, no, it's Cloudflare Workers durable objects. They are solving this consistency problem. I think what they do is you can actually write to the closest durable objects instance and read from that same one. In addition, another common question about this distributed data is people say, well, there are like countries that won't let you store their users' data in a different country. Like you have to store it in their country. Cloudflare Workers already has support for this. Fly has support. You can, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but like apparently you can do something with Fly to make that work. And then like even without these services, this has been a solved problem. Like it's been a problem for a long time, and it's pretty solved problem. So but that's another question that commonly comes up when we talk about distributed data is like, what about data privacy laws and stuff? Solved problem. Don't worry about it.
Right.
So.
Just got another question here.
I'll answer Eric's question here really quick about Ryan's article that's coming. So this will probably hit tomorrow. And here, let me double check that I'm not going to tell you something, because maybe somebody merged my pull request. Nope, they didn't yet. Okay, so if you go to remixrun/blog, right now this will just redirect you to the first blog that we had on the blog. But I have a pull request right now to add an index to this, and so when that index hits, then you can go look at that and you'll find the blog post. So.
All right.
But don't tweet about it until we've announced it, please.
All right. Hear that, everyone? No tweeting. All right. There's one more question here. Earlier you touched on data centralization in Remix, such that you don't need to maintain an additional state library. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Most of what we use central stores for, like central data stores, is for our cache of our backend stuff. This is why I was so excited about React Query, and I still think it's amazing. If you're not using Remix, then I don't know what's wrong with you for not using React Query. Like it is so phenomenally good. If you're using Remix, there's still like some use cases for React Query, but not very many. So the reason I loved React Query so much was because all of a sudden I didn't have to think about my data or my server cache anymore. React Query handled it for me. And so what you're left with when you're all done with that, as far as like global state is concerned, is you're like, well, which toast message am I showing? Like maybe, depending on how you architect that. Or, am I showing a modal? Also maybe, depending on how you architect that. And then like most of the time, your state is not going to be global. Your state is going to be like, is the dropdown open or something? That's all local state. So you do still have a state to manage, but that's like for your component library authors to think about and worry about. When you're using Remix, you very rarely need to use state or use effect or any of that. So if you don't like hooks, you're going to love Remix. I personally love hooks. I think they're great, but you don't have to use them as much. So the reason that you don't have to worry about it when you have that state managed for you by a library is just because that library is going to make sure that it stays up to date. Now, of course, like you do need to think about it. It's not like it just goes away. So you're thinking about, okay, how often do I want the this state to be cached? Like if the user goes to this page and then comes back, do I want them to get a cached version of that state, or do I want them to get it all again, or whatever? So like there, and Remix gives you control over this using web platform APIs with cache headers. So like, again, you spend more time learning about the web platform than you do Remix. Yeah, like you don't, like, where do you put any state? You don't put any state anywhere. And that's what I mean is, you literally just say, okay, here's my loader. Let me go get stuff from the database or from the backend, like further backend APIs. And then, oh, they need to make an update. Here's where I do that update. I'm just like handing stuff off, moving it around, and I'm never like actually holding it. It's hot potato with that state.
Right, and I guess if your data is fast enough to access, you eliminate that need for having like a cache of data in your application.
Yeah, and actually, I can even show you on my website. I have APIs that are not fast at all. So the Simplecast API in particular, not fast API at all. This is quite slow, especially since I need to call like 6 different APIs for that. So if I go to my Simplecast code here, I've got this fancy little cachefied thing. It's like this 200-line utility where I can say, hey, I've got my cache seasons. Here's how I cache it. I've got my cache key, how long I want it to stay cached for before I go get a fresh value. And here's how I get the fresh value. And then I have, as an admin on the site, I have the ability to force a refresh if I want to. And then a mechanism for checking the value that's in the cache in case like I change some code, we've got old cache stuff. So that's what that's for. So it's actually a really simple API to use. It's like 200 lines long. I need to open source it at some point. I mean, my website's open source, so feel free to rip it if you want. But you feel free to maintain it. But I haven't actually had to do much with it since I released this. So as far as like caching is concerned, it's still the way that I'm using this throughout my app. I'm still not thinking about where that data is living or like keeping it updated, keeping it fresh. It's all just kind of managed for me. It's actually really cool what you can do when you've got a server. It's kind of, Remix tricked me into being a backend developer. That's what it comes down to.
And a TypeScript developer by the looks of it.
Yeah, that as well. TypeScript is amazing. I can't imagine writing code without TypeScript now.
I'm kind of in that boat now too. We're all TypeScript at Neo, and any code that I write on my own now is TypeScript. And I honestly have like a pretty hard time just going back and writing plain JavaScript now.
Yeah, seriously. Yep, I'm there.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions or anything in the chat, so I guess we'll wrap it up. We're at just over an hour, so seems like good timing. Thanks so much for joining us, Kent.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really nice to see you, listen to you guys chat.
Thank you. Yes, I really enjoy talking about this stuff, obviously, so I appreciate having an opportunity to talk about it with folks.
Well, we're going to hang out in the Platform Calgary Discord server for a bit. I think there's some networking rooms that I asked them to create for us today. So if anybody has any questions that they didn't want to ask publicly, that's a great place. We also posted links to Kent's Discord server as well as the Remix Discord server, which I'll also post as comments on the meetup a little later. And I'll add a link to the Remix website as well that you did your demo from.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Serene and Ian. Really appreciate you putting this together. I know it is not easy, so thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. It's great to have you.
And thank you everyone for joining us.
We'll see you guys next month.
Okay, bye.